for North Vancouver Seymour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm happy to stand and talk about Bill 26, Child, Family and Community Service Amendment Act 2018. And I'm not going to repeat what the member from Chilliwack, Kent said in his remarks, but if anybody is interested in a holistic perspective, I would encourage people to check out his remarks. The context of the bill is that the Ed John report was delivered in November of 2016 and greeted positively by the BC Liberal government at the time. The 2017 BC Liberal platform also said that, recognized as a key priority, the government asked Grand Chief Ed John to do a comprehensive review of this area, and his report has provided guidance on the path forward. The government has already started implementing 40 of the 85 recommendations. So this bill builds on the strong foundations laid by our government in fulfillment of several more of Ed John's recommendations, most notably number 41. The province consider the following amendments to the Child, Family, Community Service Amendment Act in order to support improved permanency planning for Indigenous children and youth, and strengthening of Section 70 to include mandatory permanency planning for all children in care, including a provision to ensure that for Indigenous children, permanency plans are jointly developed by each child's family and community, including elders, cultural leaders, elected leaders, and matriarchs, and providing a provision requiring independent review of permanency plans on an annual basis. So that's why I was surprised to see a letter from the First Nations Leadership Council dated February 7th, 2018, to the Minister called First Nations Early Learning and Childcare. And this is signed by the First Nations Leadership Council, which encompasses, and I would like to mention who they are, on behalf of the First Nations Summit, Grand Chief Edward John, Robert Phillips, Cheryl Casimir, on behalf of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, Grand Chief Stuart Philip Wilson, Chief Bob Chamberlain, and Kupchik Judy, I'm sorry, I've got that probably pronounced wrong, and on behalf of the BC Assembly of First Nations, Regional Chief Terry Teague. And I'm not going to read the whole letter, but I do want to mention on the record that this is what a portion of the letter said. In effect, the province of BC's action retroactively preempt the process mandated by the BCA-FN, FNS, and UBCIC, i.e. the First Nations Leadership Council, largely on the pretext of delivering much-needed childcare funding supports to Indigenous communities as soon as possible. Although some of the province's aims are to be welcomed, in addition to long-awaited new investments in First Nations early learning, childcare, the necessity of the new funding supports must not be a way to sidestep legitimate First Nations development, and indeed that these not be mutually exclusive. Funding must not be used to divide First Nations or undercut First Nations leadership and jurisdiction. We can and should be better partners in the era of implementing the UN Declaration. They go on to say, a First Nations regional early learning childhood framework pre-implementation process is underway that will include a facilitated meeting of First Nations stakeholders involved in the policy and service delivery in winter 2018. Likewise then, because that letter was dated in February, the next document that I've got here is the First Nations Leadership Council's statement dated April 25th, 2018. So just last month. And again, they mention, we are concerned that the amendments are technical and operational and do not go far enough in addressing the principles of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, calls to action, and our inherent right to self-determination and self-government. The amendments do not lay the foundation for the more significant shift required to change the child welfare conditions where the overrepresentation of First Nations children in care remains the most serious issue. Leadership on child welfare reform is needed at all levels of government, and we can only hope that more profound improvements are needed and address some of the concerns we have voiced and which went unheeded. So I would urge the government to listen more to the First Nations Leader Council, because obviously as of April 25th, they still were not satisfied, and listen to their call to action, because the amendments do not lay the foundations of which they have requested. So I wanted to just put that on the record, Mr. Speaker, that although our side will be voting for this bill because we do support the premise, but certainly it is evident from the First Nations Leadership Council that more work needs to be done. Thank you.